Erin is originally from Seattle, and she went to University of Arizona, where she got her bachelor's degree in environmental biology and then a master's in wildlife conservation and management. And as she was mentioning before the meeting, she's been in Arizona pretty much ever since. Anyway, Erin coordinates local, regional, and national data collection projects, which she'll explain to us here in a few minutes. And we can assist in that data collection process to gather information on the timing of plant blooming and insect and wildlife cycles, and how that's been changing with warming. And that's both, nationally and here in Spokane and in our own backyards. So yeah, thank you so much, Erin, for being here. And we'll turn it over to you. Oh, a real quick couple of messages or thoughts. If we have questions during the presentation, we should use the chat feature, and then we can read them afterwards. And then also don't forget to mute your mic. Okay, with that, thank you again, Erin. It's all yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, and as Barry said, I grew up in Seattle, and we actually used to make pretty much yearly trips to Loon Lake in the summertime, and we spent about a week there. So I have very fond memories of Spokane in that area from my childhood. So let me share my screen. So I'm really excited to talk to you all today. I've been talking to a lot of different Audubon chapters lately, and I feel like Audubon people make really great observers because you all are so in tune with things happening in nature, and you're so good at paying attention to little details. So always really happy to talk to many more, hopefully potential future observers with Nature's Notebook. So I want to start out by just talking about one of the maybe most dramatic seasonal cycles that we see, which is bird migration. And I like just pick a species to kind of highlight. So we have our rufous hummingbird here as an example. This little guy weighs in at between 2 and 5 grams, but makes a migration of about 4,000 miles each year. They migrate typically up the west coast from Mexico up to their northern breeding grounds, and then back along the Rocky Mountains each year. And this is really an amazing feat for such a small creature. But it's definitely not alone. About 75% of the birds in North America migrate. And if you think about it, it's really a huge energy expenditure that these animals do every year. So if we think about kind of why birds migrate, it really comes down to resources. If all birds stayed around the equator where there's always something to eat, there'd be a huge amount of competition, and then those birds would be missing out on all the abundance of resources that occurs seasonally at other latitudes. So that's really why we see so many birds undergoing this migration. And so migration, as well as this seasonal abundance of food resources, all of those are examples of phenology. And the way we define phenology, it might be a word that you've never heard before. I certainly hadn't heard of it when I started out working with the NPN, and I actually had a background in environmental biology and all that. So the definition we like to use is it's the timing of plant and animal life cycle stages, and then also that relationship with climate and other abiotic factors, things like day length, things like that. So phenology is certainly not a new concept. Indigenous people have been using phenology since time immemorial to kind of understand when to take different actions, when to harvest foods or go out and hunt, when to undertake agricultural practices. And so you might recognize some of these moons here. These come from the Algonquin people of New England. And so things like the worm moon or the flower moon, these are things that are related to what's happening in nature, and they happen on such a regular basis that we can actually make a moon calendar from them. So we kind of can rely on these things happening. And phenology is also a great indicator of climate change. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change actually recognized phenology as a very simple way that we can track changes happening around us. Because phenology is so visible, it's things like the emergence of a butterfly or a migrating bird that goes by or flowers on a tree is something that a lot of people can observe. So it's something that we can all kind of pay attention to and track. It's also a very early indicator of climate change as well. It's something that often we can see even before we start to see population decline. So you can start to notice a mismatch between, say, a plant and a pollinator happening before you see those plants declining because of the lack of pollination. Phenology has a lot of different applications in many different fields. So I mentioned the plant and pollinator example. There's lots of other, different examples in the field of ecology. But even in things like agriculture, knowing, when to harvest crops, when to plant seeds, and then also when to manage for pests that might be a problem for agriculture. It's also important for understanding wildfire risk. So knowing about a year that might have had a really early leaf out, lots of potential fuel load that's growing, followed by senescence or kind of the browning down of those plants at a key time that can set up a really dangerous fire season. And then allergy season as well. We've actually been working on this in particular in the last couple years, but using the information about when flowers are open, when pollen is being released to help predict allergy season. And then there's a lot of applications for the field of invasive species management as well. Things like knowing when a particular invasive plant's going to be green enough where you can spray it is closely tied to phenology. Also the timing of insect emergence, which might be the time that you might want to spray a tree to make sure that you can get rid of that pest. So I'd love to hear if you want to put in the chat or unmute for a second. What are the kinds of things that you keep track of where you are? It might be, the first arrival of a bird that you are tracking, or if there's particular flowers on a plant or certain key things that you pay attention to. But I'd love to know if there's anything that you kind of look forward to that's a seasonal cycle. And I'll wait for a sec in case anyone wants to put anything in the chat. It's always a pause and then everyone starts typing at once. And then all the messages come in. Something that I started to look forward to each year is we started to get nectar feeding bats that visit our hummingbird feeder here in Tucson in usually about September, but they've been draining our hummingbird feeder the last few nights. It's pretty crazy if you go out there in the evening and see them swarming around. I can also come back to the chat, so if you want to keep thinking about it, I'll check back in a minute. Oh, I got one. Nectar flow and honeybee activity. I wasn't actually familiar with the term nectar flow until recently. I started talking with a beekeeper association, and they were talking about that term and just the importance of knowing when nectar is available for honeybees. All right, I'm going to move on, but feel free to keep putting them in the chat. I also really like this quote from Aldo Leopold, our father of ecology, that phenology is a horizontal science that transects all ordinary biological professions. Whoever sees the land as a whole is likely to have an interest in it. And I think this really captures that kind of cross-sectional view of phenology as a way to understand so many different aspects of ecology and biology and botany, ethnobotany, all sorts of different fields. And speaking of Aldo Leopold, I also like to highlight this research study that actually used data from Aldo Leopold. He collected at the shack in Wisconsin, and that work was actually continued on by his daughter, Nina Leopold Bradley. And because it's this really long-term data set of over 60 years, we're able to see the changes that have happened over time in the arrival of birds there. So he and Nina would track the sandhill crane and geese arrival. And from when Aldo Leopold first started tracking over 60 years ago up to modern times, that timing is shifted 2 to 3 weeks earlier on average. And he actually also tracked other things as well. But I think this is a really interesting example of the importance of writing down when you're seeing things and keeping track and being able to look back on those records and see that big trend and the shift happening over time. We've also documented a lot of other shifts. So just a few examples from the Northwest. We're seeing sockeye salmon are migrating earlier. Lilac and honeysuckle flowers are blooming earlier. Different timing of breeding behavior, especially in northern flickers, breeding earlier. And then also changes in breeding in western toads as well. So lots of different examples of how things are already shifting. And then going back to birds and kind of the impact of these kind of changes on bird migration, changes in these kind of things happening, like the resources and things that are that birds depend on as they're migrating, can really influence things like how long it takes a bird to migrate north. So if you imagine a bird that's migrating across the Gulf of Mexico, it's arriving into the Southeast United States, it's left the Central America with using day length as a cue, knowing that it probably will have resources because it's always been that way when it goes across the Gulf. And then it arrives and it might be that the phenology of the plants there has happened earlier. So things have already leafed out. They've kind of missed out on that abundance of resources. So that might shift, how long they might stay. They might kind of speed north to try to catch up with those resources. And it might shift their migration timing. And that might shift the arrival timing as well when they arrive at the breeding grounds. This can also affect, their body condition on arrival, which can affect the competition with other birds of that species, other species, which can influence their reproductive success during that breeding season. One example of this in particular, this is a well-documented study system that's actually in Europe and Northern Africa of the pied flycatcher. And this is a bird that migrates from Northern Africa up to Europe each spring. And it also relies on day length to know when to leave on its migration path. And typically it arrives in Europe, it lays its eggs, and it's timed this so that it has the most abundance of caterpillars available when its nestlings have hatched. And so in recent years, as the plants that are the things that it's actually like usually young oak leaves that the caterpillars are feeding on, these have shifted earlier in response to increasing spring temperatures. The food resources that this bird depends on have happened quite a bit earlier. And so by the time the birds, they're arriving at the same time, by the time their nestlings hatch, that abundance of caterpillars is no longer there. The caterpillars have now pupated, they're moths, and so they don't have that food resource. And because this is a really well-studied system, they've actually seen population declines in that bird over time. So they've seen that kind of like cascading impact of many years of this happening. We have other examples closer to home as well of things shifting. So this was a more recent study, actually going back to that idea of a long-term data set. These researchers looked at Thoreau's data from Walden Pond and looked at, when he had reported different arrivals of birds as well as activity of plants there. And found that it's actually kind of all over the place how things are shifting. So a lot of the plants are shifting earlier fairly consistently, but the birds are not all shifting earlier. Some of them are shifting, but some of them are shifting later. So things are definitely not all, changing in sync with each other, as you might expect in response to warming temperatures. And we know that because of all of these shifts, as well as habitat loss and other things, that 2/3 of our birds here are at risk of extinction. So there's definitely a lot of threat out there, and there's a lot more that we need to understand about how things are changing. In terms of how birds can adapt, I really like this series of maps from Audubon that show potential range shifts based on what we expect to happen with different climate change scenarios. These are available on their website. This again is for the rufous hummingbird, but looking at where we expect to see range lost as well as range gained in the future. And so really, I think it comes down to whether these birds can try to kind of cope with the changes that are happening where they are. And that might be changing resources, starting to go after food resources that they might not have before because it matches more with their timing. Or they have to shift, like this map is showing, and to go to new locations where they might not have been found and kind of abandon older locations that they have used in the past. So what we're trying to do at the USA-NPN is really try to understand some more of these changes, document what's actually happening with different species, both at the for birds as well as for their habitats. So we were established back in 2007, and really the goal was to be able to collect, store, and share phenology data. Back then, there wasn't a standardized way to collect phenology data. And so the hope was that by having a standardized methodology, we could have data from all across the country, and all those data could be compared, and we could really have a great understanding of how things are changing. We have kind of 4 main things that we try to do. We work a lot with natural resource managers to try to give them information about how things are changing, as well as tools to collect data themselves. We also try to just advance the field of phenology. So all the data that are collected through our platform are made available. And so we have lots of researchers that download the data and use them in their publications. We also try to just a lot of connecting around phenology. So we have a series of newsletters. We try to, when there's new phenology research published, make sure that everyone's aware of those studies. We have different communities of practice where we try to bring people together to share resources and just make sure that all these tools and things that are being developed are everyone's aware of those and being able to use them. And we're also trying to create an equitable and inclusive network. We work with groups like the Indigenous Phenology Network to try to make sure that the information that we're producing is useful to everyone that lives here. And we really try to translate information too. We're trying to do a lot of translation to Spanish to try to make sure that the resources we have available are getting the most distribution that we can to people across the country. So one of the things that we do is try to make information about climate and weather a little bit more accessible. So I just wanted to highlight this one example. And this is a map that shows accumulated growing degree days. You might not have heard this term before. It's basically a way of measuring how much heat has accumulated since the beginning of the year. You can really measure it different ways. We're using a start date of January 1st and a base temperature of 32 degrees. And so basically what we're doing is every day since January 1st that was above 32 degrees, we add up those degrees and then we add them all up across the year and we get a total amount of growing degree days. And this can be useful for knowing about different thresholds. So there's certain established thresholds for plants as well as for insects, where we know that it takes a certain number, usually hundreds or thousands of growing degree days to kind of trigger or cue something to go undergo a seasonal life cycle. So for something like an invasive insect, it might take 400 growing degree days for the adults to hatch out. Or for a plant, it might be several dozen to cue the plants to come out of dormant buds and have bud burst. So we make this available because there's not really a lot of other maps that do this at a fine scale. So this is basically pixels, little tiny boxes all across the country that show you for your location how much heat is accumulated. And where I think this is useful is sometimes if we think about what's been happening with the weather this year, we can kind of be biased by certain events that have happened. So it might have been a winter storm that really affected you, or you felt like it was really hot this one week when you were outside. But I think taking a more objective look can be kind of useful, especially when we're kind of comparing climate data to phenology data. And so I wanted to put it out there for Spokane. Do you feel like this year overall has been warmer or cooler than last year? So what's your gut feeling on that? And this is like average across the year. If anyone wants to throw out a guess.
I would say cooler.
Okay. We also have a warmer in the chat, so we're splitting it so far. Looks like we got one more. Fewer high heat days. Okay. So we have oh, I got one more before I reveal. Cooler. Okay, we got 2 coolers. Okay. So we have a tool on our website that actually shows you over the course of the year what's actually happened with temperature accumulation. And this is, I kind of just randomly picked a zip code from Spokane, so I don't know if this is relevant to many of you, but what we're looking at here is a graph. So this is starting on January 1st all the way up to recently. And then on the y-axis here, this is the accumulated growing degree days. And so we have a number of lines here. The blue one is this year. The yellow one is last year. And then the black one is a 30-year average. That's the period of 1991 to 2020. And so, you know, the higher you are up on this graph, the more heat has accumulated. So 2023 has actually been a lot warmer this year than both the 30-year average and last year. Last year was fairly average. It kind of tracked that black line. But ever since about May, I guess, you guys have been ahead of schedule in terms of heat accumulation. And if you look over here on our legend, it shows you, it kind of translates the growing degree days into days. And so it says that you're about 17 days ahead of normal right now. And the projection, which is this little red line at the end, that's showing you the future. And it doesn't really show that it's changing much. You're kind of going to stay at 17 days ahead. So I just think it's interesting to kind of look back and see, like, you know, how it's changed since the beginning of the year and then how that compares to kind of the long-term average. And if you want to do more with the data that we have a visualization tool. That's where this graph lives. And so you can type in your zip code if you want to see if your own location is a little bit different than that graph I was showing. So yeah, I can put that link in the chat too after we're done. So in terms of the actual phenology data that we want to compare to this climate information, we have a platform called Nature's Notebook, which is how you can actually do your own tracking of phenology. And this is a national program. We have observations available for both plants and animals. And this kind of shows you the distribution of where we have people observing across the country. Each dot represents a location where someone has submitted data. And then the bigger circles represent kind of places where we have a lot of data coming in. So you can see some of those really big circles. You'll see it's really clustered in urban areas, especially along the coast and in the big cities. That's where we have more people that are observing. But we're always looking to fill in those gaps geographically as well. And I think we actually now have 32 million records that are in the National Phenology Database. And all of these are freely available. So we always encourage people to go online and download the data and use it however they need. And so the way that we observe phenology, we call these life cycle events phenophases. And it's different for animals and for plants. For animals, we have you observe at the level of the species. So you would set up a site. It could be in your backyard or another place that you go to frequently. And you have basically a checklist of species that you're looking for. If you do see the species you're looking for, then we ask you what it was doing. And that's where I feel like it really becomes different from a program like eBird, where it's a simple checklist of what did you see, or even iNaturalist, where you might have a photo that you submit. We ask a pretty detailed set of questions about the activity of, say, the bird, reproduction, and development. For plants, we actually have you tag an individual plant and go back to it over time. The exception would be something like an annual plant where it's going to die every year. And in that case, you can do it as a patch where you might have an area where you expect that plant will come back. And you would just kind of, observe it year after year in the same area. But for something like a shrub or a tree, you would go back to that same individual and then you would put in information about the leaves, the flowers, and the fruits. And I think the valuable thing about doing it this way is we kind of take out that genetic question of what's happening with the plant. So we can focus on just what is the environmental impact on the phenology for that same individual. So let's say you had a leaf out of your tree in March. This year it might be different next year, and it's not because it's a different plant. It's because something else has shifted, and it's either the climate or the temperature, the precipitation in that year. And that could be really valuable information if you have a 5-year data set on the same plant year after year. You can really learn a lot about the seasonal and the annual variation. So the way that the program works, it's a bit different than some of the traditional phenology monitoring. So people like Aldo Leopold or Thoreau, they often would record the first time they saw a bird migrating or the first flowers on a plant. And that's called event monitoring. And that's great because it does tell you, the first time something is occurring, the start of something. But we actually do something called status monitoring, where we have you go back to the same individual plant or the same site to look for animals on a repeat basis. We ask for 2 to 3 times a week if you can, when things are really active, less frequently when things are slower. And this really allows you to both keep track of, the start of when things happen, but also the duration. So how long were flowers on a plant, or how long did you see that migrant bird in your area? But it also allows us to see if there's multiple periods of activity. So we have several plants here in the Southwest where they undergo multiple periods of flowering. And so if we only recorded that first event, we would miss out on all that other information. And we actually take it a step further with our platform, and we also record the abundance or the intensity. So it's not just the presence, but it's also how many flowers did you see, or what percentage of the flowers were open, or how many birds did you see, how many nestlings did you see. So we get at the peak in the data as well. And then if we have multiple peaks, we can pick up on that as well and see maybe there is a really big peak in the spring and then a smaller one in the fall. So here's an example of one of our plant protocols. This is for the red flower currant. And so you can see this is the data sheet here. It's divided up into leaves, flowers, and fruits. And it's really a simple yes or no question that we're asking. So we ask you to estimate, do you see breaking leaf buds? And let us know, did you see it, yes or no? We also have a question mark. We found early on that people were really uncomfortable just leaving it blank if they weren't sure and they wanted to circle yes or no. So we put the question mark. So if you're not really comfortable with answering the yes or no, you can still circle something, and then you can always go back and change those question marks to a yes or no once you feel more confident. And we also provide pretty detailed, what we call phenophase definitions. These really describe exactly what we're looking for. What we're trying to do is make this program available for people who don't have a background in botany, so that you don't have to know a lot about plants to participate. You can kind of see all the information here about how do you know a flower is open. It's when the reproductive parts are visible. And then even for the fruits phenophases, we have even more detailed information. Like we'll tell you what a ripe fruit looks like for that species. You'll know that it's ripe when it turns dark brown and you see like the capsule open or something like that. And then this line here, after you answer the yes or no question, is where you would put that intensity data as well. So how many, and we give you bins, which you can see an example of here. So you would say, try to estimate how many flowers or flower buds are on the plant, and you put your estimation into one of these bins. And all these are optional. So, we recommend if you want to start off small, you can just answer some basic questions like leaves, flowers, and fruits. And kind of skip the other ones. You can skip the intensity questions and just answer the yes or no questions. It's all kind of flexible and allows you to kind of ease into it rather than trying to answer everything all at once. And then here's an example of one of our bird protocols. So we have questions about the, did you see any, we say live individuals, especially adult birds. Do you see feeding, insect consumption, flower visitation, some mating behaviors, and then we have the nestlings and fledged young as well. And so you would answer yes or no again for these questions, and then you could put just a simple abundance of how many did you see in each of these phenophases. And we have definitions of these as well, although you guys probably wouldn't need those for being birders. So data collection can happen either on the app that we have, and that works offline. So if you happen to be in an area where you don't have great cell service, the data are just saved locally until you get back into Wi-Fi. Or we have paper data sheets if you prefer that, and so you can print those out and then enter the data sheets on this online interface that matches the data sheets. We also have lots of training resources available. So we have an online certification course. This is optional, but it's kind of a nice walkthrough of just how to get things set up in the system, how to set up a site, how to enter data. And then we have some more advanced modules as well, like tips on how to estimate intensity. You know, if you're looking at a big tree, trying to estimate how many flowers are on the tree. We have a module on the mobile app in particular. You also have a module that's like a practice where you watch a video and then try to answer questions after that. And we have some print resources as well. You can print the How to Observe handbook, which is basically the stuff from the certification course. We also have a really nice botany primer. If you really want to get into botany and learning more about it, it's a really nice photograph-based guide as well that you can, it's a PDF online or you can print it, whatever you'd like to do. We do offer a print copy for this through a external site as well. And then I mentioned we also have our visualization tool. This could be a great way to kind of explore the data that are have been collected near you or on species that you care about. So if you go to the visualization tool, this is the main landing page. We have a series of what we call seasonal stories. And these are really meant to give you an orientation to the different types of visualizations that we have. So this is that first one I mentioned that provide your zip code and see the accumulated heat. But we also have a few other different kinds of visualizations. So you can do things like comparing plant and animal data. You can compare climate variables to phenology. So look at things like spring temperature or precipitation and see how that relates to the onset of flowering or when birds are arriving. So that's kind of a nice way to just get like a background on the tool. But you also have the Data Explorer, which you can go directly there if you're interested in a particular species and then just see kind of what we have for that species. So here's just a couple examples. So again, the rufous hummingbird, but this is the data that we have from Washington State. We don't have a lot, so it's a little sparse, but this is the past 4 years, and it kind of shows when people have reported these individuals for the last 4 years. So this is across the x-axis here, from January 1st up until the end of the year. And then this is the proportion of those yes records. So of all the people that went out and looked for rufous hummingbirds, what proportion said yes? And so by the time we got to, looks like March or so, everyone that was looking was seeing them. And then I mentioned you can compare animal and plant data. So this is looking at some open flowers data for the current and then salmonberry, and then rufous hummingbird active individuals. And so you can see that it's kind of a nice overlap in when we're seeing those flowers available and when the birds are there. So I tried to find we didn't have a lot of data on these 3 species, but this was a year where we had pretty good data, so we can kind of see when that or where that overlap is happening. But if you want to explore other species, you can do that and create similar graphs like this. So the data that we collect, I mentioned, are made freely available, and we've had lots of different researchers use the data. So I think that's a nice benefit of our platform as well. So if you know that if you submit data through the program, they're not just going to sit there on someone's computer. They're freely available immediately for people to use them. So we've actually had 140 publications so far that have used Nature's Notebook data. And then the data have also been used in some more policy documents, things like that. They've been featured in the National Climate Assessment. They're also going to be in the 5th National Climate Assessment that's, I think, coming out soon, or going to be finalized soon, as well as some of the EPA climate change indicators reports. And we'd like to produce summaries of these phenology publications. So on this link here, which I can also put in the chat at the end, We every other month we pick out a phenology publication that uses Nature's Notebook data, and we do a summary of it that is like a plain language summary that kind of just spells out, what did they actually find? Why is it interesting? What was different about this study that is kind of unique? And we put those in our newsletters as well. I also wanted to mention that we have something called the Local Phenology Program. So if you don't want to participate as a Nature's Notebook observer by yourself, you can get together with a group of people and do it together. And we've had other Audubon chapters that have done this before. Often they'll pick out a site that's, a shared location they can all go to and set it up, and then sometimes take turns doing monitoring or go as a group as kind of a social activity. So this is the functionality we have in our system. We have a certification course for local phenology leaders that we offer. We actually have one that's going to be launching in the next couple weeks. So I can provide information about that if anyone's interested. We have a lot of program planning resources too. We really like to encourage local phenology programs to make these kind of things their own. So we want you to try to come up with a question that you have, about a particular species or set of species. Do you want to know, is climate change impacting the species I care about? Is a plant and pollinator becoming mismatched? Some sort of specific question that can kind of guide the data that you collect. And we have tons of resources about how to do that and how to create a long-term monitoring program, lots of volunteer engagement strategies and things like that. And then we also have a great community of practice. We have monthly calls where a lot of local phenology leaders come together to share resources. And then we also have a listserv and Facebook page and things like that. And then this is an example of a few of our Audubon chapters. Actually, it's a kind of a larger network called Bird Seasons California. This involves 5 different chapters right now in California. And if you go to the Nature's Notebook website, we have a great video that is it's kind of our orientation video to Nature's Notebook, but it features Audubon Star Ranch in California, and it kind of tells their story about why they're using Nature's Notebook. So I encourage you to check that out. If you just go to naturesnotebook.org, you'll see the link to the watch video, and it's just a short, about 5-minute video. And they have a lot of fun. They have different species that they're kind of focused on in the different chapters. Some of them are doing plants and butterflies and birds, and other ones are just monitoring birds. But they have been doing it, some of them, for many years now. So they have a lot of data on, the timing of migrating birds arriving to their location. They have information about the abundance of things like cliff swallows in different years. And they always talk about how they have a set list of birds that they're tracking, but they always see all these other things when they're out there. So they're always sending pictures of fun sightings and things like that, bobcats and other things. So just as a kind of recap, so you can track phenology on your own in your own backyard with Nature's Notebook. You can sign up for an account right now. Just go to the website and get started. If you want to create a local phenology program, feel free to reach out to me and I can give you some more information about that. Or you can explore the phenology data we have in the Viz tool. I also just wanted to mention, sometimes we get the question about, well, what species should I track, especially when it comes to plants, if people want to track plants, but they don't know where to start. And I really recommend checking out the Plants for Birds on Audubon. It's just a great way to kind of see what species might be important for the birds that you care about. So you can use that as kind of an inspiration of what you might want to track phenology-wise. And then I'll also mention we have a number of Nature's Notebook campaigns. These aren't really bird focused, but they are focused on species that are important for researchers and natural resource managers. So we have, for example, this is our Nectar Connectors campaign. This is focused on species important for monarchs and other insect pollinators. We also have a Green Wave campaign that tracks the green up of plants, which actually is indirectly very important for birds. If you think about, the early leaf out of deciduous trees, often that's linked with early insects like caterpillars, which is very important for a lot of our migrating birds. We also have a pest patrol campaign that's about insect pest species, and then our lilac and dogwood campaign. That's one of our longest running. This actually is an effort that goes back to the 1950s. So it's a very long-term data set that you'd be contributing to with that one. So there's more information on the website about that. And this is just an example that to join a campaign means you get these series of emails where we give you lots of like tips on observing and kind of reminders of when to go look for different things. And then we give you lots of results about what other people are reporting. So you get to see like from all across the country what people are saying about the plants they're tracking as part of the campaign. And then just a couple other things. We have a leaderboards too as kind of an incentive for observing. We have lots of really cool badges that you can earn, virtual badges for doing different amounts of observations on different campaigns and things like that. So that is all I have. You can feel free to reach out. Feel free to send me an email or I have my phone number there. And then I think if you point your phone at this QR code, this should work. If you want to sign up for our newsletters, you can do that on your phone right now and sign up that way. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer questions. I'll check out the chat too. Okay. So I'm just looking through the chat. Yes, so the phone app question is answered. I hope you should be able to find that in the App Store or the Google Play Store. Specific species in this area that are of interest. Yeah, so I would start with the campaigns probably. So the campaigns each have their own set list of species. So like you can actually, I could put a link for this. I'll keep sharing this for a sec in case anyone wants to use the QR code, but we have a species search page, and so you can actually put in your state as well as the campaign and kind of narrow down the list of species that way and see what we have available. So that's a good way to do that. But really, like we don't want to be too forceful about which species to monitor. You are limited to what's on the Nature's Notebook list, but really anything that's on there, we'd love to have data for. So I'd encourage you to think about what is of interest to you, because I think that really helps to keep you interested in the long term. We want you to find something that you're engaged in learning about. So I would start with that, explore the species search page, and then see if there's something that you'd be interested in. A benefit to selecting a campaign species is you can sign up for those campaign messages and then get that results back, and be able to get messages and stuff from us about those. And those are limited to the campaigns. And then do you have students, classes collecting data? Yeah, so we generally say, actually legally, we can't have anyone who's under 13 create a Nature's Notebook account because of the Privacy Act. But we have had even younger grades have their teacher set up an account and then kind of, do paper data sheets with kids, and then have everyone kind of like agree on the answer, and then the teacher will enter the data. But for older students, we've had a lot of examples of classrooms where students will each have their own account and enter data. And actually through the local phenology program infrastructure that we have on the website, teachers can see who's recorded what, so they can actually use that for providing credit, and making sure that students have completed their assignments. So yeah, that's it's been used pretty frequently. We've had, I think, over 100 classrooms use Nature's Notebook. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing so I can put some links in the chat. And if you need that newsletter link, let me know and I can find that too. Okay, so I'm gonna put the species search page in there.
Oh, while we're waiting for more chat information, one thought I had was we have a lot of members that have tracked certain events for decades. Is that information that would be useful on the site, or is it almost always going forward information and more?
Yeah, it kind of depends on what the data look like. We have imported data sets for people. Generally, you know, that kind of event monitoring is a little less useful for us. Although if you have a really long-term data set with a bunch of just burst records of something, that can be useful too. We kind of have to see, like, it depends on the species. It depends on kind of how you quantified the data. So we could take a look. We kind of do it on a case-by-case basis. But we also have a way to register a data set where you can just basically upload a spreadsheet of your data as is. And then that makes it available in case, like, there's someone in your area who's really looking for specific data, and then they can explore that list of data sets. But it just won't be part of the phenology database and the visualization tool. If we actually import the data, then it's included in all the tools and things like that.
Mhm.
Yeah, are there any other links that people wanted? I know I had a bunch of them in the PowerPoint. I could just start dropping them in, but I don't know if there were like any in particular that people wanted. Maybe the visualization tool.
Well, it certainly seems like your website is a tremendous resource, and people can have some fun just wandering around there.
Yeah, I encourage you to do that for sure. Here's the local phenology leader course. And then I also mentioned the video that we have. That's it's on the homepage here, and it's there's a banner at the top and it says watch video in little orange text, so that's there. And then I'll also put that data set tool. If anyone has a data set that they'd like to share kind of in an Excel format, that link in too. There's that. Are there any other things in the chat that I missed? I think that was it, right? Okay.
It looks like you've done a great job of keeping up on that. I noticed we peaked at 25 participants, which for September is very good. I know we have several of our board members are gallivanting around the country instead of being here at the meeting. But yeah, that was wonderful. Wonderful.
And I am finally seeing some of those the things that you pay attention to in terms of the seasonal events. And so thanks for sharing those. I always love reading those.
Okay.
The Cornelia cherry sounds beautiful.
Okay. Well, I'm not seeing anything new, and I'm noticing we're starting to lose folks. So again, thank you so much, Erin. This has been wonderful, and what a terrific citizen science process. It seems like a natural for a lot of Audubon members. You know, you're going to be out there wanting to look at things anyway. Just broaden your scope a little bit and write them down. This is great. Thank you so much. Greatly.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes.